was asked a question right before class, namely with respect to the eternal recurrence, the cycle of recurrences. If it were the case that subsequent cycles in eternal recurrence might alter and change in some respects in detail due to the previous cycles, so that previous cycles in some way affected and altered subsequent cycles. The doctrine of eternal recurrence is a hypothesis for Nietzsche. He is utterly opposed to systematic dogmatic philosophy with the supposition that you could prove things about nature and the world from certain logical first principles. His entire method is completely scientific in this respect. One constructs hypotheses and alternative hypotheses and sees how well they explain the known facts, and also endeavors as far as possible to falsify them. Nietzsche was sort of an early Popperian in this respect. The important thing on the test is whether they are falsifiable. And he thought that that hypothesis was a viable hypothesis. It was possible. And he also thought that it was quite plausible. But at the same time, he realizes that when it comes to the details, say, of eternal recurrence, he sometimes holds the view and considers the hypothesis that it does not alter or vary the history of a cycle, the episodes and events, from one cycle to the next. And at other times, he entertains the hypothesis that there might be some change and some alteration from one cycle within the eternal recurrence to the next. Incidentally, it wasn't too many years ago that people just dismissed Nietzsche on this score of the eternal recurrence as incoherent. Well, if it is incoherent, then modern astrophysics and cosmology is incoherent, because they have considered, modern cosmologists, exactly the sort of view that Nietzsche is talking about. There is, roughly some 15 billion years ago, there was what's been mistermed badly a Big Bang. That is a sudden, enormous expansion of concentrated energy, not matter, energy, at a very, very high thermal level, and that there was expansion. And the question is, you people all know, or should, is the velocity of escape great enough to overcome the force of gravity? The expansion is slowing down. As to how rapidly it slows down, and whether it will slow down and eventually be arrested, and the gravitational forces reassert themselves, that is an open question in cosmology today. That astrophysicists and cosmologists are very, very interested in. And one possibility is that there is sufficient mass to overcome the escape velocity of expansion. The universe in its expansion will be arrested and will suddenly fall back upon itself. That is, contract, where there will eventually be what? Eventually there will be the big crunch. Now, because of the limitations with respect to the physics that we know, with respect to the fact that Planck's constant with respect to time and with respect to space, 10 to the minus 43 seconds, that interval of time, and 10 to the minus 33rd with respect to the spatial dimensions in that. When it's earlier than that, the physics goes to pieces. That is, we do not know what will eventually happen. There are people talk about continuing to shrink to a singularity, and it utterly vanishes from the world. And there are others who maintain eventually it will reach such a state of internal instability that the whole process will repeat itself, will go over again. But how, now, with respect to the details of this exactly? Or will it vary in the different cycles? This depends upon whether the constants of nature are preserved after that reshuffling. That is it going to be the case that light will remain a constant with a velocity of 300,000 kilometers per second? Will it be the case that Planck's constant, very fundamental with respect to quantum physics, will be the same, or will it be different? With even slight variations of those physical constants, the outcome could be enormously different. We're not in a position, this is speculation, we're not in a position to say anything about that at the present time. The status of our science precludes any assured answer to this sort of question, which incidentally was Nietzsche's contention even in the 70s and the 80s, when he was interested perhaps in studying with Rudolf Boltzmann, the great German physicist in thermodynamics. That was exactly the sort of position Nietzsche took. At the present time, our science does not enable us to answer many questions of that sort. What I do want to stress, though, is you cannot dismiss the hypothesis of Nietzsche's out of hand as incoherent and unintelligible. Why should it be? Unless one holds to a positivistic theory of meaning, that simple-minded view that one had hoped had perished, at least by the time I was a student in the 50s, that is, that a proposition is meaningful only if there is a mode of verification. And its meaning is its verification. In this respect, you can say, how are we going to verify this? How is it verifiable? And the answer is, at the present time, we haven't the remotest idea how you could verify or falsify a hypothesis of that sort, but that in itself does not constitute it to be unintelligible. Also, with respect to both space and time, we do not know the finite extent of the universe, if it is finite, but presumably it is enormously large, enormous. That is, it extends far beyond the visible universe. That is what is reachable by light during the time that we have been in existence, the past 15 billion years. We simply cannot, in that respect, answer the question, what is the size of the universe? That is, we can't answer the question about its geometry. Is it spherical and finite? Or is it pseudospherical, that is constant negative curvature? Or is it essentially Euclidean, in which, of course, it is flat? That is not answerable by us at the present time on the basis of the cosmology. We know that if omega, as it's called, the ratio of the critical escape velocity to the actual velocity is 1, then the expansion will go on indefinitely, and space evolves in a Euclidean fashion, progressively Euclidean. We know that. We know that if it's less than that, considerably less, then space is going to be understandable as finite but unbounded, and it will be spherical. We have no way of answering that question. Time, as Nietzsche saw, is intimately connected up with space. And if it should be the case that space is curved, time also. Now, one has to distinguish, which Nietzsche did very carefully. If you have a very, very small volume of space, just as you do on the surface of the Earth, or about the surface of the Earth, you cannot detect its curvature by putting a flat yardstick down on the ground and seeing that it's plumb, and keep moving it and all. Persons might be doing that and think it's flat. They spend enough time and years, suddenly return to the point of their departure, in which, lo and behold, they'd be amazed to discover the earth is a globe, a sphere. We were not able to detect it because the curvature is so small that you need a considerable amount of space to detect it. So you cannot infer from what is called the local topology, the local geometric features of a surface, what its overall nature is. There's a difference between local topology and global topology. In the same way, with respect to the time that we have experienced and what we know, this is relatively short. Certainly within our lifetimes, or many lifetimes, or what we know even about our planet and all, if time were to return upon itself, that would be its general global topology. It would be very, very difficult for us to settle and to answer that question. But I do want to stress and to bring home that little minds, unimaginative ones, should not dismiss the speculations of more imaginative and perhaps more knowledgeable minds than their own about matters of this sort. One should not be arrogant in these matters. If a book and a head collide, as Emerson says, and there is a hollow sound, it does not necessarily follow that it is the book that's empty. Of course, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's the head either. So one ought to have a little bit of modesty with respect to matters of this sort, and not presume, because it is something that is novel, to dismiss it. As one of my great aunts in the past did, that little Illinois farm woman, who very characteristically and repeatedly would say about anything, "What? I never heard the likes in my life. I never heard of any such thing like that in my life," anything new, and certainly far from her being able to digest it or comprehend it. And so I recommend and suggest that you people do not take that posture either, merely because it is something that is unfamiliar. You dismiss it as unintelligible. Now I want to say some more things about the eternal recurrence and the centrality of it in Nietzsche's philosophy, even though it is a hypothesis. He connects this up with amour fati, the love of one's destiny. They are intimately connected together, love of one's destiny. Nietzsche does think that nature as a whole is systematically interconnected. That is, he rejects a notion of any sort of loose pluralism. It's a whole, but it isn't like a damn collection of marbles or something of that sort. It is such that the events are systematically interrelated within the whole, and the necessary condition for one event to occur requires the whole of the sustaining events to be brought along with it. This is a very, very old notion of a destiny amongst the Greeks. Started out with the notion of ananke, the interconnection, necessary interconnection of events, but also, beyond that, the later notion of higher harmony in Hellenistic thought, and that is a higher overarching sort of connectedness, destiny, so that all things are interwoven and intertwined. So to bring one event back means to bring all that is connected with it. Now, Nietzsche proposes this. He asks, how many can affirm their amour fati, desire it and will it, contemplate this, which is going to strike many people as frightening and nauseating beyond belief. And now it's not a question of knowing, but a question, how many of you really could affirm, accept this sort of a cosmology without absolutely going to pieces, feeling nauseated and frightened at the prospect of reliving your life over and over again in all of its detail? For those, and some, if it is possible for them to affirm amor fati, love of one's destiny, of life and nature, and will it to return over and over again, that sort of person would be one who had escaped essentially from nihilism. And so nihilism ties up with this in a very important way. If you could do that, be that heroically life-affirming about a hypothesis as terrible as eternal recurrence, then you certainly have the strength, and that exhibits the ability, as a matter of fact, to overcome nihilism. That is why it has such a central role in his thinking. It also connects up with what many commentators found utterly unintelligible as to what Nietzsche was talking about when he said the willingness to will your life and what you have done, not with remorse, not with guilt, the willingness, however, and the ability to will backwards. That is, to will your life as you have led it, and be willing to live it over and over again, such as it has been. That is very important for him, to be able to will it backwards. And what that means is, in the light of eternal recurrence, if you think this seriously, then the past is all going to return. So in the present, you will that past over again with respect to the future, if you are willing and able to do this. This is an expression of heroic affirmation of life that transcends nihilism. That is the chief significance of it. That is, this hypothesis is a test of one's courage, of one's strength of character, of one's ability to live with life and to accept all of it, all of the suffering, along with the joys, along with what? The defeats, the challenges, everything that constitutes one's life. In that respect, a willingness to affirm that. Now, this is very, very important sort of notion. That is, he says over and over again in Also sprach Zarathustra, for all joys desire eternity. All joys desires eternity. That is to hold on to them, to prolong them, or to go in the direction of repetition, to have them repeated. This is healthy. This is a magnificent expression of a life that is strong, that is rich, that is overflowing, that it is capable. I mean, in that respect, there's complete reconciliation to life. A complete reconciliation with it. Not an alienation from life. A reconciliation. So that it is natural, he thinks, for healthy human beings not to desire sleep, nirvana, death, but as a matter of fact, to desire, and to desire affirmatively, all of the joys that one has had in life. And this means willing the conditions and the suffering that goes along with it. With respect to the opposites and their tension, there is not an abrogation or annihilation of one of them. That is, your own experience should teach you that there is joy and there is depression, and that they are intimately connected up in your life, those periodic fluctuations in which the question arises, can you have one, which the idealists and the dreamers hope for, or is that quite unrealistic, that you must recognize the challenges, the triumphs, the defeats, the suffering, and the joy that goes together? So that this is a doctrine, a very, very heroic sort of doctrine that he is advancing. And here it is life in the world. It is for each and every one of you, a certain sense in which it is true, your world is your life from birth to death that has the greatest significance and the meaning for you. if you were to find any significance and meaning in life, it is in the here and now, the present. This ties up with that vision, that he who lives in the present lives in eternity. That is, there is no privileged position in time with respect to fulfillment or realization. That is to say, the immanent world process that is nature has no final resting place, no peace where everything becomes frozen being rather than becoming. This is a philosophy that stresses becoming, that takes Heraclitus with dreadful seriousness. There is absolutely no permanence at all within nature. That is a system of these forces, energy, continuously undergoing a transformation, but never arriving at a final goal. So the meaning must not be outside of nature, must not be outside of history. Do not look for the significance of your life outside of your life. That is very important. In that respect, it connects up with not waiting for your salvation, not waiting for the second coming, not waiting for the revolution, not waiting for the end of history, not waiting for what? Of what purpose could that be to you or significance? To wait for a higher species that will evolve in nature or out of you? Of what value or interest or worth in terms of that would simply make out of your life a stepping stone, a means to something external to it. And you certainly could not justify or find satisfaction or meaning, significance in your life by some however incredible species that might come upon the scene or evolve out of us. So the important thing to note is it is within the horizon of your life, birth to death, not outside of it, that you are going to either discover that your life is meaningful, and that means the extent to which you are creative. You affirm your values. Nature, the cosmos, is purposeless. I mean, it is without purpose. That's to project human anthropomorphic traits onto an absolutely impersonal nature. And it's very, very important that one recognizes that. But that does not mean that you cannot, in this case, select, will, to some extent, your own goals, finite, within your life, and a number of them, that endows your life with meaning and significance and worth. Moreover, it goes beyond that, what Nietzsche is saying. It is far more important than that. Because suppose there are no goals or ends, even with respect to your own life. I mean, is that necessary always in order for you to find meaning within your own life? That it is worth living for its own sake. Just as one might dance, and some people might dance for their health, the doctor tells them to do it, or for this or that reason. But on the other hand, there's such a thing as dancing for the sheer joy of dancing. In that respect also, being able to view the world in a comic dimension, its tragedy and its comedy, and to be able to joyously laugh at yourself and at the spectacle of events in nature, and in that respect to joyously live it for its own sake. Is it necessary for there to be a goal, an end, a purpose, cosmic or otherwise, for one to decide that life is joyous and is worth living in and for itself? Or it can be. It can be. That depends upon the human being and the conditions and circumstances in which he might happen to find himself. But I want to stress, it's utterly empty and vacuous if you think that the meaning of your life is going to be a goal extrinsic to your life, outside of it, at the end of history, or somewhere else, the end of time. No, in that respect, There is no cosmic goal, purposes, final resting point of history and nature. It is ceaseless striving, transformation, change, challenge, all of these things, which as a matter of fact most of you must know by this time, that is present and characterizes the mundane, everyday life that befalls our lot. No final state of happiness. This notion, rather sickly, perhaps anyway, that history is going to come to an end. And that, what? We're going to be in a state of becoming. Perfection, final, that is heaven or paradise. No change, the finality of perfection, and one will be in eternal bliss, knowing no misery. That's it. That is the completed state. I mean, a dreamer sort of world. And as a matter of fact, how attractive is it to anyone, and most people who want life and want immortality? They want a flesh and blood human life with the sorts of joys and things that this life offers, perhaps minimizing some of the struggle and suffering, meaninglessness and misery that we can all encounter in it. But it's been very important that we do not allow our contemplation of the future or the past to rob us of the present and what life can offer in the present. And as I say, just look at the majority of people around you. That is certainly what they do. Their life, what happens, is frittered away as they wait all week, for weekend to weekend live, holiday to holiday. You know it, vacation to vacation. And what's in between? Ennui, emptiness, and nothingness. It is precisely that sort of view which the Nietzschean philosophy is very, very intent, as a matter of fact, to reject. Repetition, and in that case, one ought to think about repetition. It is of the very essence of eternal recurrence. And as we shall soon see, I will go into it, there is a certain role of repetition in Schopenhauer's philosophy that is very, very different. Now, what may preclude or make difficult a person making this sort of move, being able to affirm or not to affirm? All sorts of questions that arise here. I mean, how does one have the courage, or would one have the will or desire to affirm eternal recurrence? Well, nihilism is one of the big problems here. And many people cannot do it, but are not aware of it, precisely because they judge and evaluate nature and life on nihilistic value schemes. If your value scheme is essentially either Christian or Buddhistic, for example, with those values, and you trace it out, then one is in a position, and this is what one does. One judges nature and history in opposition to the hereafter, and in opposition to God as the model of perfection. In the light of those values, one finds nature wanting. One can't be reconciled with it. Those values have alienated you from nature in the first place. That is one of Nietzsche's themes. That is the source and cause of your alienation. And why, as a matter of fact, you are turned away from life and sickened by it. Because you are going to find it, as Schopenhauer did, and I'll soon be discussing Schopenhauer's philosophy in this connection, that there's all this suffering, and there's all this misery that is pointless, and the pity that you feel for those that suffer, and with respect to yourself. All of those values that come in that will turn you away from nature and lead you by what right? By what right? Those decadent or nihilistic valuations, value schemes, to condemn nature as evil, as wicked. Sooner or later, That's what happens, the irony of it with respect to Christianity. God, the creator of the universe, and you judge him, the creator, and his creation in terms of those values. And the problem of evil arises. I mean, as author of, he wasn't powerful enough to have made it differently. He did not know how to make it any differently than he did. Or he had the power, and he had the knowledge, but he chose not to. What sort of a deity is that? He's not benevolent. So that over and over again, you judge nature then in those terms, and you judge it as evil, and you turn against the creator of the evil universe. And that is the source of many people's disenchantment and rejection of God. They cannot accept that God would create a universe such as this one, and they reject belief in him out of that. That is why those very values of Christianity turn eventually in the course of history on the God, and leads us, as a matter of fact, to reject him. So over and over again, this becomes very important. What is it that prevents, do you feel that way? Judging of nature, rather than looking at nature as jenseits von Böse, beyond good and evil, those evaluational schemes of good and evil. It is not beyond a naturalistic scheme of values in terms of what? Good and bad, measured in terms of life. That intrinsic value, the importance of life itself, of what contributes to what? Not merely the preservation of life, but enhances it, ennobles it, makes it more intensified. That's what, richer and not impoverished. And then one can start asking such questions as good for whom? To whom? From what perspective and standpoint? Good for which individuals? Good how? In what respects? And in terms of measured how? In terms of its contribution to life, its enrichment and enhancement? And there you can begin. But note, it is to treat nature itself as jenseits von Böse, beyond good and evil, but not beyond good and bad. And the valuational schemes are very, very relativistic to time and to place and to people and to circumstances. So we then have the question, which each person on Nietzsche's view will have to answer, and how. Is life worth living, or is it not? And what does this say about an individual when they come forth with it is either worth living, or it isn't, and worth it, given the sacrifices, the suffering that it might entail, or is it not? Very, very important, that question. Is life worth living or not? And measured how? In terms of life's own terms, an intrinsic sort of measure of it, or by some sort of a foreign measure of it? I mean, do you have some sort of an ideal? Different? Otherwise? Where does this come from? Well, we do have them out there. I mean, that's what Christianity has saddled us with. As well as if you're in the East, Buddhism or Jainism, or any number of other nihilistic religions that turn away from life and deny it. Their ideal is something like sleep in Buddhism. Eternal sleep, peaceful sleep, and an annihilation of the self. So it becomes very important to see what he is talking about here. We have to ask, is life worth living? For whom? On what terms? And what are we going to say about it? It's very interesting. What are we going to say about those that find it not worth living? How much care or concern? That's your existential problem. That's yours, if you have it. We should not allow that to sour the rest of us who might feel that life is eminently worth living with all of its challenges, its suffering, and whatnot. with respect to the pitying and self-pitying who would turn away from it, maybe we should give them a push, as Nietzsche says. Help them along the way. Of course, this isn't what you're accustomed to hearing. I mean, how many of you are precisely victims of pity that would sour yourself on life and living and existence because of these poor, poor, sick people for whom life is too much for them to conjure with or to deal with. They are too weak for it, perhaps. Well, what is our reaction to it? This is why the eternal recurrence, you see, is useful as a test. In part, how willing and capable are you of affirming it, and on what terms? And look, that might well change. There are circumstances in which one is quite willing to affirm the whole of one's life. In what situation, what condition? Is suicide perhaps never something to be countenanced or counseled? I mean, it may very, very well be, because it's not just preservation of life, but quality of the life, the quality of it. And that can vary, and vary enormously. And I can well imagine circumstances, and so too can you people, where life would not be worth living. And I certainly would not want to live under those circumstances. And I would not want friends and loved ones who cared for me to preserve me, but to act mercifully under certain circumstances. I mean, with the same tenderness and charity that we bestow upon our wild beasts and animals when they undergo enormous suffering, pointless, and their life is over with nothing worthwhile to achieve. Who wants to be left a vegetable in one of these rest homes? A vegetable, virtually. Life? Really? In one respect, one can say, there are things worse than death under certain circumstances and conditions, namely to live, and to live like that. To live, and to live like that. Now what we will do, this will lead out of this discussion here to a consideration of life, of the will to power, which go intimately together, and nihilism as a threat, and the different forms of nihilism, and what he has to say about that. I want to say at this time, note, Nietzsche espouses a naturalistic framework evaluation, as opposed to other frameworks where it's, for example, just a matter of God commands it, damn it, that's it. I mean, it's what he says goes. Either because he's the more powerful, or he is, as a matter of fact, wiser. There are all sorts of schemes of evaluation. Nietzsche is advocating, and what are the various criteria, multiple criteria, that can be used in terms of evaluating our life and a sort of conduct and behavior appropriate to different individuals in this life. It's an enormous task. We have to get rid of incredible superstitions and ignorance, yes, and old habits that are destructive and die very, very slowly. It is an amazing fact, amazing, that at the beginning of this century, about 1904, G.E. Moore comes up with Principia Ethica, a book that has had enormous influence on, and a devastating influence, I would say, incidentally, on contemporary moral and ethical theory. It is as anti-naturalistic as anything can be. I mean, Moore's Christian background, he may have gotten rid of Christianity and its God and all, but not its values, and it certainly shows there in Principia Ethica. As I grew up as a student in graduate school and almost everywhere else, one of the major points of departure, Principia Ethica, and a supposed naturalistic fallacy that did everything in its power almost to discredit, and very bad arguments incidentally, to discredit any form of naturalism in ethics. What, as a matter of fact, instead of calling it the naturalistic fallacy, he should have called it the definist fallacy. Because what he actually comes up with is moral terms like good cannot be, a moral term like good cannot be defined. It is not possible to give it a definition. What he turns out to do is say you cannot define good in terms of natural properties or natural characteristics of things. In that respect, you can't define it in terms of non-natural or unnatural properties either, which is what he should have hit home on, but he certainly did not do this. So that what is it that he comes up with? He says and informs us that good is a simple as opposed to complex. What's the criteria here for distinguishing these? A simple, and because it is simple in his view, unanalyzable, you can't break it down into further parts. That's because it's simple. So they go together. Simple, unanalyzable. Quality, he takes good first to be a noun, something like a noun, a name of a thing. And as he then pursues it, he makes out of it an adjective so that it designates some quality, like a property. Then, what he says is, and what's an example of a simple property, for example? Something like yellow. Something like yellow, a color. That's a natural property, a natural characteristic. And so what Moore is saying is, good is a simple, unanalyzable, non-natural. What, supernatural? Unnatural? Non-natural quality or property. And you wonder, he said it's undefinable. How in the world are you going to teach the meaning of that word to people? I mean, if it's undefinable, then you can't teach it to them by a definition or anything like that. How else then do you teach them the meaning of the word good? Or do you say you can't teach them the meaning of the word good? Moore's got a real problem there, a real one on his hands, as to how you go about it. And we're not clear about the distinction between a natural and a non-natural property. I mean, he explains yellow, for example, is an example of what? A natural property. Sweet was the strawberries, a natural property. But non-natural isn't defined by examples. It's just what isn't natural. And for the hell of me, I don't know what in the world he's talking about. He doesn't give a simple example except what is exactly in dispute, namely good. As to whether it's the name of anything in the first place, or a name of a quality, any quality, whether it's natural or not. But as a result of this, there's all that talk about you cannot justify or derive an ought from an is. Values are apart from facts. So you get this dichotomy of the world of facts and the world of values, and how can you get them together? Because no statements of fact or combination of statements of facts justify a value judgment. So you have that split that the whole damn century has been mired in, trying to extricate themselves. And in that respect, I want to say, with respect to general moral philosophy today, it's bankrupt, people. It's bankrupt as it can be. I mean, it removes itself off into meta-ethics, into problems and questions that have nothing to do with anything. And when it comes to real questions of normative ethics, it's cowardly and refuses to come out with any commitment about what is of genuine value. It talks rather about the language, the meta-language of morality. Bankrupt. It certainly is. In this respect, I want to call attention to also the influence of the Kantian philosophy here, which Nietzsche rejects tooth and nail, both the Hegelian and the Kantian philosophy. Here with old Kant, God's dead, but can't prove it and all, but you got to postulate it. But he doesn't want to bring that into ethics and all. So what he does is talks about the autonomous legislation of reason with respect to ethics. The autonomous legislation of reason, practical reason with respect to conduct. And he talks about the categorical imperative. Imperative, a commandment. God's dead, so it's not the commandment of God, it's the commandment of this reason, pure reason, faculty in each and every one of us, which is the same, and hence would legislate the same. The autonomy of reason, pure reason, in each and every individual in laying down the moral law. Commandments that are categorical. They do not admit of any exception. They're absolute in that respect. They hold for each and every individual, for all people, that thrust and drive to generalization. Oh, yes. And, of course, behind it, unwittingly, is buying the whole doctrine of egalitarianism, unchallenged, in its most pernicious form, in which it takes the form of, but certainly, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, anything that is right or an obligation or a duty for one must be for all mankind. What sort of a tyranny is that? And that's certainly what it does come down to, a tyranny. Admits of no exception, must be absolutely generalizable. One of the maxims of Kant with respect to the categorical imperative. I should never will otherwise than what I will should be a universal law for all mankind and for all time. Categorical imperative. General, universal, and they admit of no exception, and there is a must in them. Those are your duties. You must recognize those and do them. For Nietzsche, as you might well expect, there are no categorical imperatives. There are only hypothetical imperatives. And that goes for so-called moral principles and convictions also, moral values. Hypothetical imperatives, not categorical imperatives. And that comes down to this, that they're not categorical. If you will choose this, then this and this and this and this and this and that are means to the end, possible means, ways of achieving it. In moral philosophy, you have a distinction between means on one hand and ends on the other. Means, strategies, ways of obtaining certain goals and certain ends. And there might be many such strategies or means. There might be only one. It might be that there's none. No means available to a chosen or a desired end. But the point is, it's like this, as in Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. Which road ought I to take? And who is it that gives the response to her? Well, that all depends on where you want to go. And is it the case that you must go here or you must go there? That is, in that respect, what Nietzsche is doing is following through his voluntarism, just as Schopenhauer did, and just as David Hume also. In this respect, David Hume said, which shocked people very much, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Reversing classical thought from antiquity of Plato, there are many others in ancient philosophy that thought this way too. Plato, oh no, reason and rationality must what? Must guide and direct the passions that must be enslaved, as a matter of fact, to reason. Nietzsche with his view, and Schopenhauer too, and their naturalism. Our reason has a history, our intellect, and of a certain nature. And as a part of nature, our intellectual apparatus, all of it, must be thought of primarily in utilitarian terms, that it arises in the course of evolution as an instrument for action and for survival with respect to the environment, selected that way. And that is true of the intellect also. Always stressing not the supernatural, divine character of our intellectual faculties, our mental faculties, but that they have arisen, they have a pragmatic function, a utilitarian one. They're directed towards action and successful action. In this respect, if you take this through, there are our passions, our drives, our desires, our needs, the whole combination of these things. And it's a question, and this reason can do, provide the means. Given that I desire, need, or want this, given that, then here are the possible means, and how to evaluate between the means for achieving this or that. Reason is perfectly competent there. But between competing so-called values, things that we treasure, desire, want, is reason competent to resolve the issue as to what we must desire? That notion between goods and intrinsic goods. Something that is simply a good in and for itself, that each and every person must recognize as a good in and for itself, must choose it and will it. That if you don't see it, reason can show you. Rational argument show you that this is something that if you don't desire, you must desire. You ought to. And that's exactly what Hume denies. It is what all voluntarists deny, that emphasize and stress the priority of will, of desire, of passions over intellect. And in this respect, as has been said frequently, yes, the intellect is what? The intellect leads the way, is a guide. Yes, as the slave with the lantern goes before. What? The slave with the lantern goes before the master, which are our desires, our wishes, the things that we treasure, and the things that we value. If you take this view, reason never had. Why? Moral philosophy goes on in its endless sort of disputes over intrinsic values. And one group yelling and screaming at another about these intrinsic values as to what they are. And the question is, no. You can argue over what is preferable, or what you might prefer with respect to certain ends and goals, whether it's mutually beneficial and all of this sort of thing. But there is no such thing as a logical argument that is coercive and compelling about what values one must, as a matter of fact, choose. In this respect, what do? We come forth with this question again about the value of life. Is it worth living or is it not? And supposing that one really says, and some people do in the middle of it, it's not worth living. Are they wrong? Are you to provide them with an argument that compels them to retrace? Oh no, I see that I ought to. Not at all. And if they don't, they don't. And the question then is, what do you do with such people? I mean, should we care? Why should I care if someone doesn't want to live? Well, it might be in some cases someone that I care a great deal for and love and would like to change their attitude, a valuational attitude towards life, which might involve that I change the way they live or try and get them, persuade them to live differently so that they might value differently if they took up a different mode of life and all. But there's no guarantee that I can do that. I'm not a therapist in this respect. And most therapists can't handle it either when they get a really intransigent case of very, very deep pessimistic, depression that is life-threatening. It takes everything they can do, generally. But why do this? We do it. Take them and lock them up so that they cannot harm themselves, and do what you can with respect to preventing that. But here we have fundamental questions here about values. Note, one of the results of G.E. Moore's condemning the whole sort of scheme of evaluations that you have in Nietzsche, a naturalistic one, is also in the end to make this a case of intuition. He's an intuitionist in the end, as he has to be. I mean, good is a simple, unanalyzable, non-natural quality. Well, with respect to natural qualities, we have different senses with respect to the colors or smells or taste and so on, for natural qualities of that sort. So he has to create virtually, which is what is done when you create a special faculty of conscience that just divines the good from the bad. Or you get a case that's a compromise between a mode of perception, seeing and hearing, and a mode of thinking or reasoning. So you introduce some sort of a hermaphroditic bastard, like that of Dianoia in Plato, that's both. It's a understanding, thinking, reasoning there that is also a seeing, an immediate seeing. So that you talk about a rational faculty that just sees that this is good. Incidentally, that ties up with how in the hell is he going to teach someone the meaning of good if it is some sort of quality that is non-natural in the sense in which he talks about it. Particularly if there are people that disagree in whether something is good or not. That comes down to table rapping. That's what that comes down to. In which one party says, "You're morally blind! Morally blind! Defective conscience." And the other party can equally retort, "To hell with you, you're having a moral hallucination. There isn't any such quality out there." Be intuitive. And that is precisely the response to that sort of a movement. It gets you nowhere, that sort of talk, nowhere at all. And it certainly does not help in the least bit towards resolving various forms of controversy. What are we going to do? And how do we understand it? Those that are pro-life, what are they? Blind or morally hallucinating? Those that are pro-choice, what about the difference in valuations and how we make them and come to decide these issues? You certainly get nowhere with Moore, that's bankrupt, and you certainly don't get a goddamn step further with respect to Kant and the categorical imperative either. Bankrupt. As is virtually everything that's on the horizon in ethical philosophy today. Just think of that paltriness of Rawls on justice. Christ. I mean, one can say that virtually about every moral philosopher that's come across the scene in the 20th century that's graced our academic libraries, and that you people have had the great fortune, if you've taken courses in ethics, to be utterly bored to tears with the with the preposterousness of some of those views that are elaborately set forth to do what? To justify all of the goddamn old Christian rot, the values that's in it, without, as a matter of fact, analyzing and looking carefully at, do they serve life? Or are they hostile to life? So, we're now in a position where I think, to see the difference and to look at it, be able to get closer to Nietzsche's philosophy about the will, that we should look at Schopenhauer's metaphysics. I call Schopenhauer's metaphysics a Kantian version, because of what he owes to Kant, a Kantian version of the metaphysics of Buddhism, a Buddhistic metaphysics, a Kantian version of it. All right, let's look at it. The work appeared in 1818. Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. The world is will and representation. That's what it should be translated. Not the world is will and idea. That's idea. And that's a different notion in Schopenhauer than what he has in mind by representation. A representation is a thought, a symbol, or anything that represents or stands for something else, and we employ and use a representation. He gets this from Kant. The work is divided into two major sections. The earlier part, beginning with the world as representation, and the latter part dealing with the world as will. I'm not going to deal very long on the world as representation. It is very, very much a Kantian sort of view, which, as it ends up, the world on Kant's view as it is in itself, apart from our modes of experiencing it, through sense perception and through thought, the categories of the understanding, through thought, the world in itself is, in that sense, unknown, the unconditioned, the thing in itself. Those are unknowable aspects of the world. What we do is have various representations of objects in the world, as those objects supposedly affect our sensibility and give rise to what percepts, images, and so on, that are representations. They're not identical with the things in themselves. Things in themselves, unknowable. And with the Schopenhauer, you have the distinction between, as things are in themselves, the inside, so to speak, and the surface of things outside that are mirrored, that are reflected, that we represent, that has that notion. And when it comes to the world, and he wants to say there's two sides to the world. The world is representation, and that's essentially given to you, he thinks, in Kant's philosophy. And then another aspect of the world as it is in and of itself. And he thinks you can know, immediately and directly, the thing in itself, that you can know it. Because after all, we are existent beings. And in that respect, we are things in themselves, but human beings. And we can know what is at the kernel and the heart of our nature. And it is what Schopenhauer called will. And by will, he meant desire, appetite, appetition. He's talking about the passions, the affects, and particularly the appetites, the drives. That is at the very heart of our being. That is, we know the difference, so Schopenhauer thinks, intuitively between my arm rises as it's in attraction, and it's elevated, goes up, and I raise my arm. There's a difference between I raise my arm and my arm arises. And there are various cases where my arm might rise as someone lifts it up and so on. But in the case of I raise my arm, that is what? That is the fact that my arm rises, but also that I do it, and that my will, if you want to put it that way, as Schopenhauer does it, my will is inseparable from my acknowledgement and recognition that my arm is going up. It's not just going up, but I am the doer of the deed. I do it. And the act of will is what? Inseparable from the bodily act. There is the arm, which is representation, if you like, and the arm itself as an embodiment of will, of my will. And this is what Schopenhauer meant and had in mind by saying, I have an immediate knowledge of my inner self as drives, passion, appetite. It's this part of his philosophy that I want to look at in connection with what he says about will and his romantic pessimism. It's not merely a romantic pessimism, it's a nihilism. that Schopenhauer is driven in the end with a Buddhistic set of values, which also are very, very close to Christian values too. To condemn nature and life is evil and is not worth living. I mean, Schopenhauer has no room for God. God is already dead in his philosophy. There is just a monism. Nature, the world as a whole, a single whole. And what is it in its inner nature? It is will, appetition, in which he wants to say one has to understand it by a certain sort of analogy. That is, there are various degrees of what he calls will, and here what he has in mind is force. I mean, it's the various forces that play a role in physics. Gravitational force, the electromagnetic forces, and so on. And that's the only forces known at that time. The weak nuclear and strong nuclear forces, of course, were not known. So that everything was either manifestation of gravitational force or of electromagnetism. But Schopenhauer now is writing before the unification of electricity and magnetism by Clerk Maxwell in the 1860s. I mean, he's writing and developing this within the framework of the sciences of 1818. But there is still that view, and you want to say, but what are forces? I mean, in their inner constitution and nature of attraction and of repulsion. And for Schopenhauer, you can know that only by consulting your own inner constitution and nature, in which you are familiar with drives, appetites, cravings, and in that respect, he wants to say, look, there is will with a big W will. That's cosmic will. And there are grades and degrees of it, and they are the forces of nature. The very magnetism, electricity, the electrochemical forces. Those, the whole division of forces that now we simply subsume under electromagnetism today, the whole of chemical binding into forces, of those forces. This is very, very important then to take note of, that he's using that and saying that there is a grade and objectification of those forces in our own nature and constitution. And there he uses little will, with a small w. And you try to understand the nature of forces and personal forces in nature, will with a capital W, by means of a little will, small w. That is what it is to experience and have cravings, desires, appetites, and so on. This is at the heart of us. If you want to know, in that respect, it's not cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Thinking and thought is the most superficial aspect of existence, is what Schopenhauer would say. Nietzsche would agree with him in that respect. No, it is I will, or I desire, therefore I. Or better, is another form of it for Schopenhauer, I suffer, therefore I am. Nothing drives home more the recognition of your own existence and what it is than to be aware of your desire or craving, or the fact that you suffer. And if you really want to know something about a human being or other agent, you don't find out much about them by knowing what they think, what their thoughts are, if you want to understand them and be able to predict their behavior. Not their thoughts, but where is their heart? What is it that they treasure? What is it they want? What are their desires? That's the motive for life, the drive, the dynamic to action. So that if you want to understand that, you get at the character of the person's will, his desires, his passions. That tells you more than anything about how superficial thought and how easy it is to be deceptive and even to deceive oneself about one's thoughts and perhaps even one's deepest beliefs. So there you have that sort of a view of the world as will, striving, and dynamic. And there is the source of pessimism. And there is another there, cycle, a sort of eternal recurrence in Schopenhauer that is very interesting. What then is life? Perpetual struggle, craving, desiring. One is driven in existence to sustain and fulfill one's cravings, one's needs. Existence then is thought of as a pendulum by Schopenhauer between, on one hand, unfulfilled desire, craving, unfulfilled desire, struggle in an attempt to do what? In an attempt to satiate one's desires. Hunger, driven by it, but it's in principle insatiable. I mean, one satisfies one's hunger only temporarily, to have it exhausted, and to be driven to satisfy one's hunger again over and over. Thirst, the desire and need for warmth, sexual gratification and desire, the force of that sort of a drive. But you cannot. That's the very nature of the dynamic of the will. There is no such thing as final fulfillment and completion. This rest, this happiness, this peace, in which one is not driven into existence to satisfy these cravings, desires, and urges that are only temporarily appeased to reassert themselves. That is, the will is in principle insatiable. And not only that, if we succeed in satisfying, even temporarily, those desires or all of them, we're fortunate enough in nature that we've gotten the food and the drink and sufficient warmth, maybe clothing, and some sexual gratification, sated. The pendulum runs in the opposite direction here, and when we are completely sated in a desireless state of not desiring and wanting anything, what is it? Ennui, boredom, incredible, and nothing weighs heavier on us than ennui, than boredom. We have nothing to do. There's nothing that we want. That we are just what? Aimlessly, the emptiness of life, of our existence. And life in the tedium and ordinary vacillates, oscillates back and forth between those alternatives. Never going to complete a task or anything else. Every time I go into the kitchen to do dishes, and I'm doing dishes there, I get that sense of deja vu and of eternal recurrence. And Jesus Christ, this is never going to be over with. I mean, for the rest of my life. Insofar as I'm not going to hire a housekeeper or hire a wife to do all of that stuff for me, or something of that sort. I'm going to perpetually, nor a dishwasher. I'm going to perpetually and have to look forward to that until the very end, I suppose. But note, what is important about this is not merely the pendulum here, but another character in which desire is absolutely insatiable in terms of its demands. If you have the luxury of it and all, that is, one starts out just with food, nourishment. But one's taste becomes more and more refined in this connection, and one isn't really satisfied with the ordinary McDonald's fare and so on of everyday life. You people know that. Maybe you don't. Hopefully one day you'll get beyond student life and you'll see that there is something out there better than a McDonald's, Big Mac, or a Wendy when it comes to eating. If you do before long then, the more and more refined the taste, more and more demanding, so that eventually it's nothing short of Russian caviar and all of the other things that go along with it. I mean, the great pate, the what? Truffles. Yes, not just mushrooms, but truffles. All of the, and it becomes more in hummingbirds' tongues, Romans, and so on. And in principle, insatiable with respect to consuming and consumption and the demands. Incidentally, this modern consumer society in which we live is absolutely a Schopenhauerian will to consumption, and often absolutely crazy in that respect. But this is true also. Mere water? No, you become like the French decadent in the Foreign Legion, who's found out on the desert, as you go up to him to help him and all, and he's lying there, and he's like, champagne. I mean, eventually it comes precisely to that state, does it not? With respect to our taste, more and more refined, more and more demanding, decadent in a certain way. I mean, the kid says, all I want is a pair of wheels, that's all, I'll be satisfied. So he gets them, has it, his little car and all. And before long, oh, no. And he sees one of these, Cadillacs that goes by, and his heart is set on it. And he knows, oh, if I could only have the Cadillac, my heart would be completely quiet and satisfied. It's the object of my greatest desire. And he no sooner gets it, and one day he's driving down the street, and it is fatal. He looks up, and his heart is frozen, and greed pops out of his eyes as he sees what? As he sees a silver cloud, Rolls Royce, going by. Then once again, the appetite, the desire is pressed. Oh, but now I know really, truly what I want, what alone would satisfy me. We know this. Couples very early, if I only had a sex partner, satisfaction, some sort of gratification there. And so he finds one, or he gets married. Bliss forever after. Or bliss after forever. Finds sex, all he wants. Well, that goes fine. First few months, 6 months, 8 months. You go over to the house, and you find them driven out of ennui and desperation so quickly in decadence or exploration. You go in to find them trying it, swinging from the chandelier in the living room and so on. We all know that. That is the absolutely unquenchable character of desire when it is satisfied to thrive upon itself, to thrive, live upon itself, grow. In that respect, Nietzsche then points out that Schopenhauer, that this is a matter of a futility. Life that is utterly futile and can only be sustained by lies and deception and illusion of a conviction that I shall be happy and satisfied if only this. And sooner acquire it than it is abandoned, that it fails to satisfy, and one is driven on in pursuit of something else. If you really solve, so it's sort of an endless cycle, this business. One works to satisfy the desires and appetites, and reproduces for the cycle to continue on and on with respect to one's children. This endless sort of repetition that constitutes a life and existence, that goes nowhere, that is ultimately futile, that is passed on, and all the illusions of a final peace, happiness, satisfaction, cow's paradise, Christian cow's paradise. All of those illusions that without them, and this is what is interesting, it begins to look like, and this is where the idea originates, maybe mankind cannot live with an absolute realization of what life is all about, apart from lies, apart from illusions. The vital lie, the vital illusion. Now then, that raises some very, very interesting questions at this point, because at the same time, Nietzsche gives a litany that goes on and on about what is involved in life, childhood, adolescence periods, senility, growing old, before you die, losing your mind, your memory. You don't recognize your loved ones. That goes past. Your physical strength is run down, depleted, along with the disintegration of your spiritual self, what you call your soul or mind. Nothing is more terrible than for it to die first, which it certainly can do. And with respect to life, the diseases, the misery that afflicts people throughout the world, starvation, which is the rule for many people throughout the world, not enough merely to subsist. Don't talk to much of the third world out there about a soul or spirit. There's a price tag attached to that, and they know it. And they can't even afford it to talk about soul or spirit. I mean, they're desperate to try and merely survive without perishing from day to day. I mean, certainly what we ordinarily consider spirit is not within the ambit of those people. If they look upon us with a certain envy, you should not be surprised. They are not so stupid as to think that what you call spirit doesn't come with a price tag and a cost and a substantial material cost. In that respect, my folks, they are not deluded by any such Christian nonsense as blessed are the poor, but horseshit. And anyone knows better than that too. That is not to worship mammon. It is to be realistic about the conditions that make possible a satisfactory life. You people know it. You know it just as well as I do in that respect. So, one has here then the recognition of how rampant suffering is throughout the world. I mean, diseases, and they may befall you at any time. I mean, the simplest thing can happen. A little disequilibrium with respect to a blood pressure and a burst vessel in the brain or in the heart, which may not be lucky enough to die, but to be incapacitated and miserable for long periods of time. Well, sickness, how widespread that is, apart from all of the physical suffering, and in this respect, to take it seriously, life, for the most part, existence in life is to suffer. A Buddhistic theme, and a theme from the Upanishads too, that Schopenhauer picks up on. It colors his whole evaluation. Look, when he's talking about other people in the world and what may happen to you, he is also playing on your pity and self-pity. He's exploited that enormously. And you've got to be on your guard about some of it. He has a jaundiced eye, this Schopenhauer. The misery and suffering that is widespread is unquestionably there, along with this pattern and view of the utter aimlessness of life. Once again, we have the circle, and a circle of absurdity, in which nothing gets fulfilled, nothing gets completed. It is what? A purposeless pursuit after gratification and satisfaction that is not lasting, that is banal, in the end, trivial for the most part. That is the whole conception of what it is to live in Schopenhauer's philosophy. And he says an explicit, insofar as there is so much evil without purpose, nature is evil. Is evil. And it is not worth living. And he then begins talking about later on possible courses of salvation. Is there any escape? Is there any out from this lunacy, this madhouse, that we are like the squirrel in the cage that's going round and round and round and round and round and round, chasing his tail? That is Schopenhauer's conception. It is certainly one that could easily sicken one with respect to life and its prospects. I say he has a jaundiced eye, a jaundiced eye, evil eye for existence. Because he never hardly interrupts with respect to his litany of causes of despair, anxiety, fear, the suffering that we go through with, and the eventuality of death. Hardly ever lessens that for one moment by looking at the fact that all sorts of people, in all sorts of circumstances, in the very midst of suffering and mourning, can celebrate, be joyous. That is the moments of great joy, of celebration, of peoples that have their occasions of feasting, the occasions that are celebrations of life. And these are people that are capable of doing it in a life of hardship and of misery. I mean, there is a certain courage there, a certain integrity, but also the prospect and the possibility of these people finding joy in life. This sort of a theme, which is Nietzsche, which Nietzsche is going to emphasize, an anti-Schopenhauerian, comes out in whom? Do people know of a writer that has emphasized this sort of theme in opposition to Schopenhauer? It's a Greek. Katsantzakis. People know who that is. His writings are very interesting on that score because it's a very anti-nihilistic, anti-Schopenhauerian work, all his works written after what? Written, infused with the sort of vision and the sort of anti-Schopenhauerian, anti-nihilistic view that you get in Schopenhauer. So let's consider and look at this a bit more closely. We have then his enormously pessimistic, nihilistic view that life is not worth a living, that nature and life are essentially evil. And one has to really look at what lies behind this sentence passing, this judgment that Schopenhauer passes upon nature, and what sort of values does he use in this connection. And I mean, here one is going to have to consider not merely self-preservation, but one is going to have to consider what? The enhancement of power and life in various of its forms, the importance of invoking criteria and considerations of that sort, naturalistic sort. So, there are some points here to be made. Schopenhauer over and over again speaks of the will to live and what? The instinct of self-preservation. And Nietzsche rejects that. He says that there's no evidence at all of a universal instinct of self-preservation. Suicide shows that over and over again. And also the fact that people are willing to risk their very life for excitement and to live dangerously. That is, they are not merely concerned in the quantity of life, but they are concerned in the quality of it. And for the thrill and the enjoyment and enhancement of their life, they not only climb mountains and race automobiles and do all sorts of things, which makes it perfectly clear. And they're not stupid, they are not dead to the risk that they run, but they unhesitatingly and willingly, as a matter of fact, take such risk. And those phenomena go against any such mere principle of what? Of the preservation of life, the will to life at all costs. And as a matter of fact, Nietzsche substitutes for that notion of will to life, will to power. And the will to power is will to what? Not only greater reserve and quantity of life, but greater enhanced power, greater enhanced what? Greater enhanced richness with respect to life, the quality of it. That is what we desire. That is the drive that is behind this notion of will. Schopenhauer's notion of will, in the first place, is, according to Nietzsche, utterly bogus. Utterly bogus, and misconceives it. Because he identifies will with desire, appetite, volition, with desire, appetite, drive, and all. And Nietzsche says, that is precisely what is not will as we ordinarily understand it, and in which we speak of willpower. A person that acts in Schopenhauer's fashion, if you try and follow it out, and Schopenhauer says this, that he acts according to the strongest drives within his nature, and so on. That is a description of life, and particularly of human life in those terms, that make out of a person something that is essentially passive reactive, and that is unable to avoid responding to a stimulus, in which there is no notion of inhibiting an impulse to respond to a drive or an appetite. It is the sort of individual, everything goes, that is the slightest little stimulus in the environment to a response to gratification or satisfaction is immediately acted upon. Whereas will involves a postponement. We talk about willpower, and we talk about deferring it, and we talk about what is the exact opposite of what Schopenhauer has, namely resistance to impulse and desire, and the ability to withstand temptation, the ability to withstand acting on impulse immediately. And that is the phenomenon that has to be understood, and to be understood more. That is Nietzsche's will to power is not will in the sense in which Schopenhauer is talking about it. Schopenhauer, as a matter of fact, there is the ordinary idea that people have of will power, of desiring and being very, very tempted to act and to respond to stimulus in the environment, stimuli, that promises certain satisfaction, and to be able to resist the satisfaction on behalf of a deferred later satisfaction of a greater or different sort, and to postpone it. And even the phenomenon that is so interesting that people rarely think of in this connection, and that is learning, which we do, to postpone a gratification and satisfaction immediately, because the deferring and the postponement enhances it. What is all this business about desiring to seduce the other person? But right away, no. It's in the postponement, the deferment, the enjoyment, that can arise out of this in our rich emotional life that entails and involves the ability to, in the presence of the stimulus, to resist it. And that is the beginning. You must see that as the first step in coming to understand what Nietzsche meant by will as opposed to what Schopenhauer meant by will. That is the first step in getting clear about that phenomenon that arises in the course of history and which is really something that we acquire. It is a portion of spirit, that is the human animal, that has been tamed and domesticated and learns certain interesting tricks which the animal in the state of nature does not have with respect to its acting on impulse and with respect to its desires and the various affects. And this is an extremely important point that is to be made. So, Nietzsche's will is very, very different from that of Schopenhauer. It's a very, very subtle spiritual phenomenon that results later on. It is not to be thought of as something mental. The dichotomy mental and physical is rejected by Nietzsche. It's to be understood in terms of what? That embodiment of forces, the different expression of forces in our nature, in which the mental, that is one of the errors, one of the illusions of philosophy, as is too the purely physical, the body as purely physical. I mean, the body has to be thought of in this connection as a vehicle of forces in dynamic interaction. And the mental, along with the physical, are both expressions of the underlying forces, not opposite dichotomies. This is an extremely important thing to come to grips with as a basic sort of notion here. Now I want to say some more things about this that are important at this point. It is not self-preservation, the will to live, but the will to power as a greater and greater enhancement and enrichment of life that is possible only through being in possession of oneself and in possession of power. And now this ties some themes up, and I want to tie them up right now because it is important, so that you see it even before it comes. The major thing about power for Nietzsche is the extent to which it is tied up with the discipline, and with individual discipline. And the main thing about power is mastery, and it is self-mastery. That is the fundamental notion. You begin with mastery, with self-mastery, because there is no mastery over others or over nature without having acquired self-mastery. And self-mastery is a matter of arduous, long discipline and training. And in this respect, it also is the source of power that gives oneself power over oneself, and the ability, as a matter of fact, to modulate and to direct that power with respect to others. Long training. All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. Spinoza. That is, look, the child, and this is something that apparently that gets completely forgotten in modern times. The child has to be trained, the animal, into being a human being. That's why what we have out there today are a lot of animals running around wearing clothes and talking. I mean, it's extraordinary. You have to teach them hygiene, how to cleanse themselves. They have to be, what? Housebroken, toilet trained. You have to teach them about when you talk about the ultimate, the bare conditions of civilization, it's not out there in large measure. Just go to any goddamn supermarket and look around. If you can hold your nose and other things too, I mean, wake up. I mean, how much education do these people have on a very, very basic level? You wonder about criminality and about the sick, and then we have them in our society? Well, what about education and training and where it begins? And what they are taught to do? So even with respect to very minor skills, one wants to be a musician, and one wants to play a particular instrument and be good at it. There's going to be one hell of a lot of investment and time, even if you have this native, talent for it, to acquire the skill and mastery. It takes time, one hell of a lot of time, and energy and work over years to become a proficient violinist or pianist. Much less talk about the sort of skills that you must master to be able to be a composer and to write music or anything else. It's pretty hard work for most people to learn the minimal skills of getting along in our civilized society. Are we doing it today? Reading, being able to keep your bank account, have enough basic mathematical savvy to be able to tend to your business, to write a letter, to read it. Look what we've got out there. When you wonder about what is the criminal, very much. What is the criminal understood in certain ways? It's a wild animal in some respects. A wild animal in which there has been a failure of domestication and training. And that should really strike home. But of course, you don't take that seriously if what you think you've got out there is not a bunch of animals, but a bunch of little bastard angels coming from the hand of God. Then you don't take seriously naturalism and the natural world in that respect. And that's just why some of the worst efforts and all are Christians that just let their kids grow up spontaneously. And that goes along with a certain mythology that they have about what children are. With their little angels. And we know that isn't so. But note, mastery over one's self. And now, for Nietzsche, over and over again, life is activity. Action. Not passive contemplation and reflection. It's doing. In the beginning was the deed, the act. The thought comes later in reflection. But life is oriented of necessity, Schopenhauer's right about this, towards action and doing. Acquiring. Motor activity. Action and Nietzsche. This is where this becomes very important. Not only activity and action that's aimless, but is guided by rules on behalf of seeking and acquiring certain goals. And where he wants to talk about creativity, because creativity and the notion of creation is at the very heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. We are creatures in a way, but not created. But we are creatures of nature, but we are also creators. And a part of what you have to get clear about if you want to talk about creating and creating values is also the work of creating yourself and what it is to make something, a person, a spiritual being, and not an animal, out of yourself and out of your life. The possibility of this, what it involves, and it's not easy. I mean, it's a matter of enormous labor. And now, Nietzsche follows Aristotle in this respect by saying, happiness is not a passive state,
It is the accompaniment of an activity. That it is certain sorts of activities that we engage in that give us the spirit, the sense of what? Of strength and of health, and are also connected with a sense of well-being, and not just well-being, but joy in doing, in activities. This is an Aristotelian notion, and Nietzsche gets it from Aristotle. So that initially, look, the child who tries to learn to play the piano, and you have to force him to do it, and he hates the practicing and all that, but gradually becomes better and better. Eventually, he can come and play a little melody or song, much to the delight and the amazement of his friends, and he soon finds that he likes practicing. And soon you can't drag him away from it. And that sense of mastery, of power that he has over that instrument, the piano, the power, the mastery over it is a source of that activity. And mastery and self-mastery and accomplishment is power, is a source of sense of power for the person, and it is also intimately connected up with an individual's happiness. The sort of individual that one is, the sort of skills that one has come to master. And that means the raw instincts and the impulses in human nature that are trained, that are educated. And what is involved in that mastery begins with oneself. And that's just what most people don't have or understand in the modern world. They don't. The other day I was watching a group, a string trio. And it was interesting watching them, watching one little girl there who was filled with admiration and wonder and mouth open, sort of thing that would be inspiring. She gets from her mother $1 and comes and puts it in the, where they're giving money to people in the string quartet. There were two other little bitches around there, about 16, said, I mean it, little sluts. It's exactly what they looked like, and that's the way they acted and talked. And that's what they were, sluts, two of them. And they were looking. And they were looking with admiration in their eye, like, no, with petty little envy. And I was over near enough where I could hear them at making derisive, well, I could do that if I wanted to. It's not much music, what I call music. Little bitch, what sort of ears do they have for music, anything like that? I can imagine what they're listening to all the time, about their level of taste, discrimination, and intellect. But you could tell. I mean, they were egalitarian. I can do this, I could, if I wanted to. And my reaction is, you little bitches, no you couldn't. I mean, no you couldn't with your spoiled manner and your mode and your way of life. No, you're never going to do it. You don't know discipline, you haven't been taught it, and you probably don't have the skill and the ability to do this in the first place. You don't have it in you. And even if you did, you're not going to realize it and become any such thing because you will not pay the price and the discipline that is required in doing it, as you won't do for many other things either. You're not going to learn another foreign language. You're never going to be able to read anything in the sciences with comprehension and understanding or mathematics. You will do nothing. You will make nothing out of yourself, except what you are by animal nature almost. That's obvious from the way they were talking about the size of one of their boyfriend's thing. I mean, which was right there. I mean, which obviously they were concerned about that they will lead nothing but the life of two sluts. I predict that very fervently. And I hope that they enjoy it and are capable of living the sort of life that they eminently deserve and are entitled to. But the point of this is that here there is a matter of mastery first over oneself. And that takes a lot of discipline and a lot of work, and in many respects, the work of a lifetime for the benefits that can come from it. And those that cannot master themselves can hardly be expected to master or serve as masters, political or otherwise, over other people. That is terribly important. But now there is that notion of the will to power as a creative endeavor, and with respect to the individual imposing some sort of form. It's creative activity. It's work, like the work of artists, except you yourself, your life, happens to be that work as you fashion it, that you achieve that sense of enhanced, enriched life. Boy, that's something you've got to work for. Enhanced, enriched life. Note what is not present in Schopenhauer. Why this looks as aimless as can be in many respects is there's not growth. And what is acquired in character, a personality, a person, a human being, in which it's not just activity of aimlessly satisfying basic desires, but inhibiting them and acquiring skills that are themselves, in the exercise of those skills, a source of satisfaction and gratification. That is the happiness that is inextricably tied up with exercising one of those skills and acquiring mastery of it. So his view was very, very different from what some people think. And also, if you reread it through and look at it through, there's all the difference in the world, as close as they might see, between the philosophy of Schopenhauer and the philosophy of Nietzsche. Schopenhauer is world-weary, world-denying, sick nihilism. And Nietzsche struggled to overcome it to a healthy ability to affirm life, to live it creatively at the highest and the most powerful level that an individual is capable of achieving. And it isn't any simple business that one is talking about there. Okay, next time it will be life and will power.